The gate was broken on a Tuesday, and Lydia Chandler fixed it before Homer Finley even knew it had been touched. The summer of 1882 had arrived in Sagebrush Creek, Texas, with the particular cruelty that only a high plains summer could manage: relentless sun, dry wind that sucked the moisture from a person's lips before they could even think about licking them, and red dust that settled into every crevice of every building on every street in town. It was a hard place to live, and harder still to love, and yet people did both with an obstinate ferocity that surprised even the ones doing it. Lydia Chandler had been in Sagebrush Creek for 3 years. She had arrived with her husband, Thomas Chandler, who had possessed more optimism than practical sense, but enough charm to make up the difference. They had come from Georgia with 2 mules, a wagon full of household goods, and the kind of hope that people only carry before life has had sufficient time to disappoint them. Thomas had planned to farm the quarter section of land he had purchased by correspondence from a man he had never met, and for a year and a half, things had gone remarkably well. Then Thomas had died. It was a fever that took him, quick and merciless, in the deep of January 1881. He had been 31 years old and healthy as an ox the week before, and then the fever had come and he was gone in 9 days. Lydia had buried him herself, with the help of the preacher, Reverend Albright, and a neighboring couple named the Garcias, who had come with a pot of soup and stayed for 3 days to make sure she did not collapse from grief. She had not collapsed. She had wept until there was nothing left to weep with, and then she had stood up, put on her dead husband's canvas work coat, and gone out to tend the animals. Lydia was 34 years old in the summer of 1882, which put her firmly past the age where widowhood was considered a temporary condition. The women in town, the ones who gathered on the steps of the general store on Saturday afternoons, had concluded among themselves that Lydia Chandler was the capable sort, which they meant as a compliment, but which Lydia understood to also mean that they expected her to manage just fine without any help, and that the men in town would not be lining up to court a woman who clearly did not need courting. She did not mind this conclusion particularly. She had her farm, small though it was. She had her chickens, her 2 mules, and a garden that produced enough vegetables to supplement her income from taking in mending work. She had a friend in Rosa Garcia, who brought her tortillas and gossip with equal enthusiasm. She had, in short, a life. What she did not have was a reason to walk past Homer Finley's ranch every morning. That changed on the first day of July. Homer Finley's ranch sat 3/4 of a mile north of Lydia's property, which meant that the road between her farm and the town of Sagebrush Creek passed directly along the eastern fence line of his land. This was the road Lydia walked every Tuesday and Friday morning to collect her mending work from the women in town, and every Wednesday to visit the general store run by old Mr. Beaumont, and she had walked it without particular incident for 3 years. Homer Finley himself she knew only by reputation and the occasional glimpse. He was 38 years old, dark-haired and broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had once been handsome and had been weathered by years of outdoor work into something better than handsome, something with character and weight to it. He ran cattle on 800 acres of decent grass, employed 2 hands named Pete Dawson and Calhoun Reed, and was known in town as a fair man who paid his debts and kept to himself. He had never married. The women on the general store steps had theories about this, ranging from a broken heart in his youth to a general disinterest in female company, but nobody knew the truth of it, and Homer Finley had never offered any information on the subject. Lydia had never spoken to him, not once in 3 years. She had nodded to him once in the street outside the feed store, and he had nodded back, and that had been the full extent of their acquaintance. On the first day of July, walking into town at 6:30 in the morning, when the air was still cool enough to be pleasant, Lydia noticed that the main gate in Homer Finley's east fence was hanging wrong. It was a heavy wooden gate, the kind built from thick cedar posts and cross-braced with diagonal boards, and it was clearly off its upper hinge. The gate hung at an angle, its lower corner dragging in the dust, the iron hinge bolt visible and obviously loose where it had pulled partially free from the post. Lydia stopped and looked at it for a moment. It was not her gate. It was not her fence. It was not her property in any sense. And yet the gate was broken, and a broken gate in cattle country was a serious matter, because cattle were creatures of enormous stubbornness who would walk through any gap presented to them, and then spread themselves across 3 counties before anyone could collect them. She looked up and down the road. There was nobody else in sight. The ranch house was visible in the distance, still quiet in the early morning. She could see the small bunkhouse off to the left where Pete and Calhoun presumably slept, and there was no smoke from either chimney yet. Lydia set down her basket, took hold of the gate, and lifted it back into alignment. The hinge bolt had partially worked itself loose, but the wood around it was still sound. She found a large stone near the fence post and used it to hammer the bolt back into its seat with 3 firm strikes. She tested the gate. It swung properly. She retrieved her basket and walked on to town. She thought nothing more of it. The following morning she walked past again, this time on her way to return mending she had finished the night before, and the gate was hanging at its angle again. The bolt had worked loose once more, which told her that the underlying problem was that the bolt was simply the wrong size for the hole it sat in. It had been drilled too wide at some point, perhaps when an old bolt had broken and been replaced hastily with whatever was on hand, and now the fit was too loose to hold under the constant push and pull of the gate's weight. She stopped again. She lifted the gate and hammered the bolt back with the same stone, which she noted was still sitting near the post where she had left it. She thought about the problem as she walked. The proper fix would be a new bolt of larger diameter, or a wooden shim packed around the existing one, or ideally a new section of post altogether. But the temporary fix of hammering it back would do for now. By the 3rd morning, she had begun carrying a small collection of items in the bottom of her basket beneath her mending. A piece of hardwood shim material she had cut from an old piece of planking in her barn, a hammer small enough to carry without trouble, and a bit of wire. She was not sure exactly what she would need, but she had learned in the years since Thomas died that being prepared was always preferable to being caught without. She fixed the gate again on the 3rd morning, and on the 4th, and on the 5th. By the 6th morning, which was a Sunday, she walked the road specifically to check on it, carrying nothing but her tools, and found it hanging loose again. She fixed it and went home. This became, without any particular decision on her part, a routine. Every morning when she walked the road, which was not every morning but was at least 4 or 5 mornings each week, she checked the gate. When it needed fixing, she fixed it. When it did not, she walked on. The bolt would hold for sometimes 2 days, sometimes 3, before the constant wind and the weight of the gate, and the vibrations of cattle moving along the fence line worked it loose again. She did not announce this activity to anyone. She mentioned it to Rosa Garcia one afternoon when they were sitting on Lydia's porch drinking coffee, because Rosa was the kind of friend to whom Lydia told things she would not tell anyone else. Rosa looked at her with dark, thoughtful eyes and said, "You know whose gate that is, Lydia?" "I know," Lydia said. "Homer Finley, the rancher." "I know," Lydia said again. "Why don't you just tell him it needs a new bolt?" Lydia considered this question with more seriousness than it probably deserved. "Because it needs fixing in the meantime," she said finally, "while whoever is going to fix it properly gets around to doing it." Rosa smiled the particular smile she had that suggested she understood more than was being said, but she did not press the matter, and Lydia was grateful for that. The truth, which Lydia did not say aloud to Rosa or to anyone else, was that she found the routine strangely satisfying. There was something clean and uncomplicated about having a small problem she could solve completely every morning. Her life contained a great many problems that could not be solved completely. The uncertainty of the harvest, the slow erosion of her savings, the loneliness that she mostly did not look at directly because it was easier not to, and against all of those large and mostly intractable difficulties. A gate that just needed its bolt hammered home every few days was a genuine relief. Also, though she absolutely refused to examine this aspect of the matter too closely, it was the gate of Homer Finley's ranch. She had begun noticing Homer Finley in a way she had not noticed him before. She saw him occasionally at the general store, standing at the counter talking to Mr. Beaumont with his hat in his hands, his dark hair pressed flat from where the hat had been sitting. She saw him once at the feed store, hoisting 50-pound sacks with an ease that suggested he had been doing it so long it had ceased to require conscious effort. She saw him, one early evening, standing at his own east fence line with his arms folded on the top rail, looking out at the sunset with an expression she could not read from the road but that seemed to contain something private and a little sad. He did not see her fix his gait, or if he did, he never said so. The second week of July, Lydia arrived at the gate on a Wednesday morning and found something unexpected. Someone had attempted a repair, not a good one, but an attempt. A piece of wire had been twisted around the bolt in a rough approximation of a shim, which had the right idea behind it but was executed badly enough that the gate had still worked loose by the time Lydia arrived. She stood looking at the wire for a moment, feeling something she could not quite name. Then she carefully removed the wire, packed the hole with the wooden shim she carried, seated the bolt properly, and walked on. That evening, coming home from returning mending, she passed the gate again. It was still in place. On Saturday of the second week, Homer Finley was standing in his yard near the barn when Lydia passed the gate. He was too far away for conversation, and she did not stop, but she was acutely aware of his presence as she checked the gate. It was still good, she noted, and walked on without touching it. She did not look toward the house. She kept her eyes on the road and her pace steady, the same as always. She wondered if he had seen her. The third week of July was hot in the way that makes people in less determined parts of the country give up and go home. The temperature climbed past 100 degrees every afternoon, and the air shimmered above the road in waves that made distances uncertain. Lydia carried a clay jug of water on her morning walks and drank steadily. The gate needed fixing on Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday of that week, and she fixed it each time without particular drama, sweating through her shirtwaist by the time she was finished and standing in the thin shade of the fence post for a moment before walking on. It was on the Thursday of the third week that she first truly saw Homer Finley up close. She had just finished hammering the bolt home and was testing the gate's swing when she heard hoofbeats on the ranch road that ran from the main house to the east fence. She turned and found Homer Finley riding toward her on a big bay gelding, and for a moment she felt the peculiar paralysis that comes from being caught doing something you have been doing for weeks without thinking about the fact that you were doing it without permission. He reined the horse in on his side of the fence and looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for what felt like a very long time but was probably 3 seconds. Up close, Homer Finley was more striking than she had appreciated from a distance. His eyes were a dark gray-green that she could not quite categorize, and there was a quality of steadiness in them that she had not expected, not the studied flatness of a man who was hiding something, but the genuine stillness of a man who was comfortable with silence. He had a jaw that could have been carved from the same cedar as his fence posts, and his hands on the reins were large and work-darkened and looked entirely capable. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she replied. He looked at the gate. He looked at her. He seemed to be working something out in his head. "Gate was loose," she said. "I can see that," he said. "Or rather, I can see that it's not loose anymore." She nodded and picked up her basket and prepared to walk on. "Wait," he said. Not urgently, but with enough weight in the word that she stopped and turned back. He was looking at her with that steady gray-green gaze and something that might have been confusion. "How long have you been doing that?" "About 3 weeks," she said. He said nothing for a moment. The bay horse shifted its weight and stamped at a fly. "I didn't know," he said finally. "I know you didn't," she said. "I noticed the wire was gone," he said. "I put that wire there myself, thought I'd gotten it to stop." "You had the right idea," she said honestly. "The hole's too big for the bolt, Wire wasn't quite the right material for the purpose. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read, somewhere between gratitude and something more complicated. "I appreciate it," he said. "What do I owe you?" "Nothing," she said, his brow furrowed. "Nothing. The gate needed fixing," she said simply, and she walked on. She felt his eyes on her back all the way down the road, and she kept her pace steady and her chin level and did not look back, though she wanted to. That evening she sat on her porch and watched the sky go orange and pink above the flat horizon, and thought about those gray-green eyes for longer than was strictly sensible. The following morning was Friday, and she arrived at the gate and found it loose again, not as badly as usual, just a slight sag that had developed overnight. She fixed it quickly and walked on, but Homer Finley was riding the fence line that morning. She saw him perhaps 100 yards to the north, moving slowly on the bay gelding, checking the posts. He saw her at the gate and changed his direction, riding toward her along the fence. She had fixed it by the time he arrived, but she had not yet picked up her basket. "Morning again," he said. "Morning. Lydia Chandler," he said. It was not quite a question. He knew who she was, which meant he had asked, which meant he had thought about her after yesterday's meeting. She felt this knowledge settle somewhere low in her chest with a warmth she had not felt in a considerable time. "That's right," she said. "And you're Homer Finley." "I am," he said. He looked at the gate, then back at her. "I meant to ask yesterday, and I should have asked first thing and not let you just walk away, why you've been fixing it. Every morning, for 3 weeks." She considered several answers. There were plenty of things she could say that were true and that were also partial, incomplete, the sort of truth that answers a question without really answering it. She could say that she was walking this road anyway. She could say that she had a habit of fixing things that needed fixing. Both of those things were true, but standing in the early morning light with his gray-green eyes on her and the honest weight of the question between them, she found she did not want a partial answer. She was tired of partial answers. She had given herself enough of them over the past year and more. "Because it needed fixing," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and then a smile broke across his face, slow and a little surprised, like the sun coming over the horizon, and it transformed his whole face, and she thought she had never seen a more sudden or more complete change in a person's expression. "That's the whole of it," he said. "That's the whole of it," she confirmed. He shook his head once, not in disagreement but in something like wonder, and then he looked at the gate again and then back at her and said, "I've got a new bolt somewhere in the barn, proper size. I should have put it in weeks ago." "You should have," she agreed pleasantly. He laughed. It was a brief sound, not particularly loud but genuine, and she felt it in her sternum. "Could I ask your opinion on which size would be best? You seem to have given this gate more thought than I have." She tilted her head slightly. "I have 10 minutes before I need to be on my way." "That's enough time," he said, and he dismounted and tied the bay to a fence post, and they stood together at the gate while she told him about the oversized hole and the need for a larger bolt or a proper wood shim set with glue. And he listened with genuine attention, not the patient forbearance of a man waiting for a woman to finish talking so he could do what he'd intended all along, but the real attention of someone learning something they wanted to know. It was the most useful conversation she had had with anyone who was not Rosa Garcia in a very long time. She walked on after 10 minutes, as she had said she would. He watched her go, and this time she did look back once, just briefly, and found him still watching, which she supposed confirmed something. She fixed the gate again the next morning and the morning after that, and Homer Finley was not there both times, but she could see fresh work near the barn that suggested he had been occupied. She did not mind. The gate was still the gate, and she was still walking the road, and the routine was still the routine. On Tuesday of the 4th week, Homer Finley rode out to the east fence at the time he had apparently calculated she would be passing. She arrived to find him already there, dismounted, with a cloth bag hanging from his saddle horn. He had the gate open and was looking at the post with the expression of a man conducting a thorough inspection. "Morning," she said, setting down her basket. "Morning. I found the bolt." He held it up. It was the right size. She could see from 10 feet away a heavy iron bolt with a solid head and a proper diameter that would fit the drilled hole snugly. Also found some decent shim material in the barn, dry oak from an old barrel stave. "Oak will hold better than pine," she said. "That's what I figured." He looked at her. "Would you care to do the honors, since you've put more work into this gate than I have?" She was not sure if he was being polite or testing her or something else entirely, but she said yes, and he handed her the tools, and she found herself crouched at the gate post doing the work while he held the gate steady, a job that, she noted, required him to stand fairly close to her, close enough that she was aware of the warmth and solidity of him, the faint smell of horses and cedar and clean morning air. She packed the hole with the oak shim, seated the bolt, drove it home with 3 clean strikes of the hammer and tested the gate. It was solid. She stood up. "That'll hold for a good while now," she said. "Thanks to you," he said. He was looking at her with an expression that she was beginning to recognize, that particular combination of steadiness and something warmer that came into his eyes when he was thinking something he had not yet decided to say. "What is it?" she asked. He seemed surprised that she had read him that directly. "I was wondering," he said, "if you might like to come up to the house for coffee, if you have time. I know you said you had mending to deliver." "The mending will keep another hour," she said. He smiled again, and she thought that she could grow dangerously accustomed to that smile. The ranch house was a solid 2-story structure built from limestone blocks, which was common in that part of Texas, where good timber was scarce, but the plateau country provided plenty of stone. It had a wide front porch facing east and a kitchen that was larger than Lydia's entire cabin, with a good iron range and a proper coffee grinder on the counter, and a table big enough for 6 that currently had newspapers and account books spread across one end. Homer Finley made coffee with the efficiency of a man who had made it alone every morning for a long time, and Lydia sat at the table and looked at the account books without prying, and out the window at the dry July grass and at the 2 hands, Pete and Calhoun, who were visible in the distance working on something near the far stock tank. "You live here alone?" she asked, because it seemed an appropriate question, and she was tired of dancing around obvious things. "Since my father died 4 years ago," he said. "He and I built this place together. He came out from Kentucky in 1871 and bought the land, and I came out 2 years later when I was old enough to be of use." "Kentucky," she said. "I'm from Georgia." He set the coffee cups on the table and settled into the chair across from her. "Thomas Chandler's widow," he said, not unkindly. "I knew him a little. He was a good man." "He was," she said. There was nothing strained in saying it. Thomas had been a good man, and she had loved him, and she had grieved him thoroughly, and life had continued. "He died in January of '81. "I know," Homer said. "I was sorry to hear it at the time. I should have said something to you in town, but I didn't know you, and it seemed presumptuous." "It wasn't a time when I much wanted conversation," she said honestly. He nodded, understanding this. They drank their coffee and talked about the weather, which was genuinely concerning. There had been no rain for 6 weeks, and the grass was thin, and the creek that ran through the south end of his property was running lower than he liked to see in July. He talked about cattle prices and the reliability of the railroad depot in Abilene, and she talked about the difficulty of keeping a kitchen garden watered through a dry summer, and it was entirely ordinary conversation, and she was aware the entire time of the quality of his attention. The way he did not look past her or through her. The way he asked questions that followed from what she had said rather than steering the conversation toward himself. It was 45 minutes before she picked up her basket and said she needed to be going. "Come back," he said, and it was not quite an invitation and not quite a request and not quite a question. It was a word that sat in the space between all three. "I'll be passing the gate tomorrow morning," she said. "Good," he said. She walked the rest of the way to town with a lightness in her step that she recognized and was mildly astonished by. She had not felt that particular lightness in a long time. It was the lightness of anticipation, of something having shifted that could not easily be shifted back, and it was terrifying and welcome in equal measure. She told Rosa that evening. Rosa put down her tortilla and looked at Lydia with enormous satisfaction. "I knew it," she said. "Nothing has happened," Lydia said. "Something has happened," Rosa said firmly. "You had coffee with Homer Finley in his kitchen, and you walked home with that look on your face. Something has absolutely happened. We talked about the weather and cattle prices. That is how it starts," Rosa said wisely. "Raphael and I talked about whether the Perez family's corn was going to make it through a drought the first time we were ever alone together. We were married 8 months later." "That is not," Lydia started, and then stopped, because Rosa was looking at her with those dark, knowing eyes, and arguing with Rosa when she had that expression was a waste of a perfectly good evening. The following morning Lydia fixed the gate. It had held, which she had expected, but she still stopped to check it because habit was habit, and also because Homer Finley was sitting on his porch with a coffee cup, visible in the distance, and he raised the cup in a small salute when she looked up. She raised her hand in return and walked on, but she was smiling the whole rest of the way to town. He rode out on Thursday. Not to the fence this time. He came down the road on the bay gelding, moving at an easy trot, and pulled up alongside her as she walked. "I was heading to town anyway," he said, which she strongly suspected was not entirely true. "I could ride alongside you if you don't mind the company." "I don't mind," she said. He dismounted and walked the horse, falling into step beside her, and they talked the whole 3/4 of a mile to town about a remarkable variety of things. His opinion of the territorial government's handling of water rights, which he considered inadequate. Her observations about the differences between Georgia farming and Texas ranching. A book she had been reading. A Dickens novel she had borrowed from the schoolteacher, Mrs. Holt, which Homer had also read years before and had strong feelings about. The price of beef on the hoof versus the price of beef on the hook at the Chicago stockyards, which was a matter he had been following with professional attention. She noticed that walking with him felt natural in a way she had not expected. He matched her pace without shortening his stride ostentatiously, as some tall men did when walking with shorter women, making a performance of accommodation. He simply walked beside her as though they had been walking the same road together for years. In town, he tied the bay outside Beaumont's general store and tipped his hat to her and went inside. She went to collect her mending from Mrs. Alderman and Mrs. Wheeler and the schoolteacher's wife, and she was aware the whole time of a pleasant low hum of gladness that she had mostly given up expecting. On the walk home he was waiting outside the store, apparently having finished his business, and he walked back with her. Near the gate he stopped and patted the post approvingly. "Holding fine," he said. "Should hold through the summer now," she said. He looked at her, then with the expression she had come to watch for the steadiness and the warmth together, and said, "I've been thinking that it would be a proper thing to do to invite you for supper one evening. Not just morning coffee. If you were interested." She looked at him steadily. "I'd be interested," she said. Something in him settled, like a man who has been holding his shoulders tight, releasing them. "Saturday evening," he said. "Saturday evening," she agreed. She walked on to her farm, and the rest of the afternoon was occupied with mending and watering the garden and feeding the chickens, all entirely ordinary activities that she accomplished with a sort of warm distraction, thinking about gray-green eyes and the particular way a man could say a simple thing like "come back," and make it mean considerably more. Saturday evening arrived with the particular beauty of a Texas summer dusk, the sky going purple and orange above the flat horizon, the first stars appearing while the light was still fading, the air cooling to something tolerable. Lydia wore her best dress, which was a deep blue cotton that Thomas had bought her the Christmas before he died, and she had pressed it carefully the night before and put her hair up with the ivory combs that had been her mother's. And she walked the road to Homer Finley's ranch in the long evening light, feeling more alive than she had in a year and a half. He met her at the gate, the now solid, properly bolted gate, and he was wearing a clean white shirt and his good hat, and he looked at her the way men in books were always described as looking at women, but that Lydia had not personally experienced being looked at in some time, and she felt it in the full length of her spine. "You look very fine," he said, with a simplicity that was better than any extravagance. "Thank you," she said. "So do you." He had cooked supper himself, which impressed her. Not every man in that time and place was capable of managing a kitchen alone, but Homer Finley had clearly been cooking for himself long enough to be competent at it. He had made a beef stew with dried peppers and onions that smelled wonderful, and there was fresh cornbread, and he had gone to the trouble of acquiring a small jar of preserved peaches from Beaumont's store for dessert. They ate at the big table in the kitchen, with the evening light coming through the windows and the sound of cattle moving distantly on the grass, and they talked for 2 hours without running out of things to say. He told her about growing up in Kentucky with a father who was restless and a mother who had died when Homer was 7, and how moving to Texas had felt like finding the place he was supposed to be. He talked about building the ranch up from a few scrubby head of cattle to the operation it was now, and the satisfaction of that work, and also the loneliness of it. This last thing he said simply and without complaint, but she heard the weight under the simplicity. She told him about Georgia, about her parents who had both passed now, about meeting Thomas at a church social when she was 25, and him being the first man who had ever seemed genuinely interested in what she thought about things, and how that had seemed to her at the time a remarkable quality in a man. She talked about the 2 years she and Thomas had spent building something here, and about losing him, and about the particular way grief changed shape over time without ever fully going away. He listened to all of it with complete attention and said, "I'm sorry about Thomas," and it was the simplest condolence she had ever received and somehow the most adequate. After supper they sat on the wide porch and watched the stars come out fully, spread across the sky in the thick, brilliant canopy that was one of the undeniable compensations of living in a place with so few other lights. An owl called somewhere in the dark. The cattle were settling. "I should tell you something," Homer said after a comfortable silence. "All right," she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars. "I've been aware of you for 2 years," he said, "in the way that you're aware of someone at a distance, just a shape in your peripheral vision. Thomas Chandler's wife. I knew who you were after he died. I thought about saying something to you in town more than once." "Why didn't you?" He turned to look at her. "Because I didn't know what to say," he said. "I'm not a man who talks easily to people. I'm better with cattle." He paused. "And because you looked complete. You walked through town with that basket and that chin up, and you looked like someone who had everything managed, and I didn't want to presume." She thought about what Rosa had said, that capable women got left alone because people assumed they didn't need anything. She had not quite believed it was visible, but perhaps it was. "I was managing," she said. "Managing is not the same as not wanting anything." "No," he said. "I know that now." They sat in the stardark quiet for another little while, and then he walked her home down the road. And at the lane that turned off toward her farm he stopped, and so did she. And they stood facing each other in the deep blue dark. "I'd like to do this again," he said. "So would I," she said. He took her hand slowly, giving her every opportunity to decline, and held it for a moment, her fingers wrapped in his large, warm ones, and the touch was so careful and so deliberate that she felt it everywhere at once. Then he released her hand and stepped back and said good night, and she walked the last 100 yards to her door with the feeling of his hand still present on her fingers like warmth. August arrived, and the drought broke on a Tuesday with a thunderstorm that came roaring up from the south and dropped 2 inches of rain in an afternoon, and made the creek run briefly brown and fast before settling back to a clean flow. The grass responded within days, greening at the base of the dry stems in the way that never failed to seem miraculous, and the cattle spread out across the rejuvenated pasture with evident satisfaction. Homer and Lydia had been in the habit by then of taking supper together on Saturday evenings, alternating between his ranch and her smaller farm, and walking the road together on Thursday mornings when his schedule allowed. The gate had not needed fixing since the new bolt was installed, but Lydia still checked it every time she passed. Out of a habit she saw no reason to break, and Homer had begun to watch for her in the mornings from the porch or the yard. Pete Dawson and Calhoun Reed had noticed this development and were treating it with the careful discretion of men who worked for a man they liked and who understood that commenting on the situation would be unwise. Pete was a compact, quiet man in his middle 40s who had been with Homer for 6 years and was loyal to the point of resembling a very competent piece of furniture, always present, never intrusive. Calhoun was younger, perhaps 25, with a tendency toward talking that Pete periodically redirected with a look. It was Calhoun who finally said something, not to Homer but to Lydia, on a Saturday afternoon when she arrived early, and Homer was out on the range checking fence with Pete. "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Chandler," Calhoun said, appearing from the direction of the barn with his hat in his hands and a look of careful earnestness. "But I just want to say that the boss hasn't been like this since I've known him. Like he's expecting something good to happen. It's a nice change." Lydia looked at the young man with the frank appraisal of a woman who had learned to read people. He was not being impertinent, he was being, in his own awkward way, protective. He cared about Homer Finley and was making sure, in the only way available to him, that Homer's interests were being looked after. "I understand," she said. "I appreciate you saying it." He nodded and retreated to the barn, visibly relieved that he had not been snapped at. Homer returned from the range an hour later, dusty and warm, and she had started coffee in his kitchen by then, having learned where everything was well enough to manage it. And he came in through the back door and stopped when he saw her standing at his range in his kitchen in the late afternoon light, and he looked at her with an expression so unguarded that she had to look away for a moment because it was almost too much to receive all at once. "You started coffee," he said. "It was ready to be started," she said. He took his hat off and hung it on the hook by the door and came and stood beside her at the range, close enough that their arms were nearly touching, and said, "I've been thinking." "About what?" "About this," he said. "About what this is. About what I want it to be." She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with the full weight of those steady gray-green eyes, and there was nothing guarded in his expression, which told her that whatever he was about to say had cost him something to work his way toward. "I'm not a man who does things halfway," he said. "I built this ranch to last. I do things right or I don't do them. I've been trying to figure out how to say this in a way that doesn't sound like I'm running ahead of where you are, but I'm not going to keep dancing around it. I think you're the most remarkable woman I've ever known, and I'd like to be courting you properly, if that's something you want." The kitchen was quiet around the hiss of the coffee pot. Outside, a mockingbird sang 2 bars of something complicated and stopped. "I think," Lydia said carefully, "that we've been courting for the better part of 6 weeks, and you're just now getting around to naming it." He stared at her for a moment, and then he laughed, a real laugh. Not the brief flash she had seen before, but a full, genuine laugh that she wanted to keep as a permanent possession, and he said, "I suppose we have." "Yes," she said. "To be clear, yes, I want you to court me." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face, the most tentative and gentle thing, and she leaned infinitesimally into the touch, and he saw it, and something in him went very still and warm at once. "Good," he said softly. They had their supper and talked until long past dark, and when he walked her home that night, he held her hand the whole 3/4 of a mile, and it was the simplest and most complete thing. September came and the air lost its killing edge and began to carry the first notes of autumn, dry and clear and smelling of grass and cedar. The cattle were fat on the recovered grass, and Homer was in good spirits about the fall shipping, and Lydia had taken on a commission from Mrs. Alderman for a proper quilt that would occupy her evenings through the winter. Things were good in a quiet, solid way that was different from the thin, effortful good of the year after Thomas died, when she had kept herself moving through sheer determination. This was a different quality of good, the kind that came from having a foundation under you. But not everything was uncomplicated. In September, a man arrived in Sagebrush Creek who called himself Dale Orton, and he had with him a land claim that he said superseded Lydia's title to the quarter section she had farmed for 3 years. He was a lean man with a flat mouth and a way of talking that was all surface smoothness, and he went to the county recorder's office and filed papers, and 3 days after his arrival Lydia received a notice that her right to the property was being contested. She stood in the kitchen of her small farmhouse with the notice in her hand and felt the ground drop out from under her. She had the deed Thomas had purchased by correspondence. She had always had kept it in the tin box with their marriage certificate, and the letters from her parents and Thomas's watch that she could not bring herself to sell even when money was tight. But the deed was a messy document. The correspondence purchase had been through a middleman, a land agent in Dallas who had since died, and the original survey lines were not entirely clear, and Orton was claiming that the quarter section overlapped with a larger parcel that he held title to through a grant that predated Thomas's purchase. She went to Homer with the notice that evening, not because she was helpless but because he knew the county, he knew the legal landscape, and she trusted him. He read the notice in the kitchen with Pete Dawson sitting at the table because Pete, it turned out, had some experience with land law from a dispute that had arisen over his brother's property in New Mexico some years back. "This Orton," Homer said quietly. "Do you know him?" "Never seen him before this week," she said. "Pete," Homer said. "He's a speculator," Pete said without looking up from the notice. "The grant he's claiming looks legitimate on paper, but grants like that were contested in 3 counties along this stretch of the frontier in 78 and 79. Most of them didn't hold up. The question is whether the original survey has been properly registered. Can we find out?" Homer said, "County seat, whoever handles the land records." Pete looked at Lydia. "You have your deed?" "In the tin box at home," she said. "Get it," Homer said. "We'll ride to the county seat tomorrow." "Homer, don't," he said, and his voice was gentle but firm. "You fixed my gate every morning for a month and asked for nothing. Let me help with this." She looked at him for a moment. There was no debt in what he was saying. He was not calling in a favor, and she knew that. He was simply present, offering the weight of his presence, and his resources in the way that someone offers those things when they have decided that another person's difficulties are their difficulties also. "All right," she said. "Thank you." They rode to the county seat the following morning, the 3 of them, Homer and Pete on horseback and Lydia in Homer's wagon, which he had hitched without her asking because it was a 20-mile journey. The county land office was a dusty building with a clerk named Morrison who was bespectacled and precise, and knew his records with the thoroughness of a man who took genuine pride in a job that very few people appreciated. Morrison looked at Lydia's deed. He looked at Orton's claim. He went into the back room and was there for 40 minutes while the 3 of them waited on a wooden bench in the outer office. When he came back, he was carrying a large survey map and wearing the expression of a man who has found exactly what he hoped to find. "The Orton grant," Morrison said, spreading the map on his counter, "terminates here." He put his finger on a line. "The Chandler parcel begins here." He moved his finger a quarter inch. "There is no overlap. The parcels are adjacent but non-intersecting. Mr. Orton's claim is without basis." Lydia closed her eyes briefly. "He'll be informed," Morrison said with professional satisfaction. "In writing today." Homer placed his hand over Lydia's where it rested on the counter, briefly and without ceremony, and she turned her hand under his and held it for a moment. On the ride home she was quiet for a long time, watching the flat country go past, and Homer drove the wagon beside her with the same quality of comfortable silence that she had come to love about him. The way he did not fill quiet spaces with unnecessary words, the way he understood that some things needed processing and that processing was not a social activity. "I was scared," she said eventually. "I know," he said. "Not of losing the land exactly. I mean, yes, that too. But that land is what Thomas and I built together. It's the last physical thing that connects to who we were and what we were trying to do. I couldn't stand the thought of someone just taking it. Nobody took it, he said. No, she said. She looked at him. Thank you for coming with me. There's nowhere else I would have been, he said simply. Dale Orton left Sagebrush Creek within the week, presumably to find some other property to contest in some other county, and Lydia's title was confirmed and the matter was closed. Rosa came with tamales to celebrate, which Lydia ate sitting on her porch in the October air, feeling the particular warm solidity of a woman who has faced a hard thing and come through it. October deepened and the country shifted into the amber and gold of autumn. The grass cured on the stem to a fine pale yellow, the sky a high clear blue that seemed to belong to a different season entirely. The cattle drives had gone north, and Sagebrush Creek had its brief autumn quieting, when the trail hands were gone, and the town settled back into its own rhythms. Homer had begun spending Sunday afternoons at Lydia's farm, helping with the small maintenance jobs that had accumulated. The barn needed a new board in the south wall, the chicken coop latch was failing, the garden needed to be turned under before hard frost. He did these things not because she could not do them, but because doing them together was better than doing them alone, and she had stopped protesting the help with the same speed that she had accepted it in the first place, which was to say quickly once she had decided it was the right thing to do. They worked well together, which she had suspected would be the case, and which turned out to be even truer than expected. They did not crowd each other, and they did not need to explain themselves to each other. And when something needed to be discussed, they discussed it without the elaborate negotiations she had witnessed in other couples who could not seem to speak plainly to each other. One Sunday afternoon in late October, they were both sitting on Lydia's porch with the end of the workday behind them and the cooling air around them, and Rosa and her husband Rafael Garcia had come by on their way home from visiting the Garcia's son in a neighboring town, and had stayed for an hour, drinking coffee and being warm and funny and present in the way they always were. And when they left, Homer and Lydia sat in the quiet they left behind and watched the last light fade from the sky. "I want to tell you something," Lydia said. He turned to look at her. "When Thomas died, I thought that was the end of the part of my life that had warmth in it," she said. "I don't mean I was going to do anything drastic. I just thought that had been my portion and the rest of it would be managing. And I was prepared to manage. I was good at it." "You are good at it," he said. "But managing is not the same as living," she said. "I've said that to myself several times since July, and every time I think I understand it a little better." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with those steady eyes in the fading light. "I've been thinking something similar," he said slowly. "This ranch has been my whole life for 10 years. Every decision I've made for a decade has been about the cattle or the grass or the water or the fence. All necessary things. But there's a difference between a necessary life and a full one." "Yes," she said. He reached across the distance between their chairs and took her hand. "I love you, Lydia," he said. It was direct and simple and entirely unhurried, the way he said most things that mattered. She looked at their joined hands in the dusk light, and at his face, and she felt the thing she had been feeling build in her chest since July name itself completely and without reservation. "I love you too," she said. He squeezed her hand once, and they sat together in the growing dark, and it was one of those moments that she understood even as it was happening she would carry it for the rest of her life. November arrived with the first bite of real cold, the kind that came overnight and surprised everyone who had grown comfortable with the long warmth of the Texas autumn. Frost appeared on the grass in the mornings, melting by mid-morning, and the creek ran clear and fast with the increased flow from upland rain. Homer had brought in his cattle from the summer pasture, and the ranch had the settled, cozy quality of a place hunkered down for winter. On a clear, cold Saturday morning in the middle of November, Homer came to Lydia's farm not in the afternoon as was their habit, but in the morning, riding the bay gelding and leading a second horse, a compact gray mare that he sometimes used as a spare. He was wearing his good coat and his good hat, and he dismounted at her gate with the manner of a man who had thought carefully about what he was about to do and had concluded that he was ready. She was in the yard feeding the chickens when he arrived, and she looked up at him with the handful of grain still in her hand and raised an eyebrow. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. He came through the gate and stood before her in the frost-bright morning air, and he reached into the pocket of his coat and produced a small cloth bag that he held out to her. She set down the grain, brushed her hands clean on her apron, and took the bag. Inside it was a ring, a simple gold band set with a small garnets, dark red and honest and entirely unlike the elaborate things she had seen in jewelry cases back east. She looked up at him. "I bought it in the county seat when we were there in September," he said. "I've been carrying it around for 2 months trying to decide when the right moment was. I've concluded that there probably isn't a perfect moment for something like this and I should just ask." She waited. "Lydia Chandler," he said, with the weight and steadiness that was so entirely him, "I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I want you to come to the ranch and make it your home, and I want us to build something together that's bigger than what either of us has built alone. Would you marry me?" The chickens clucked around their feet. The frost sparkled on the grass. The sky above was cold and blue and enormous. "Yes," she said, and it was the simplest and most complete word she had ever said. He took the ring from the bag and placed it on her finger, and it fit, which made her suspect he had either been extraordinarily lucky or had gotten Rosa involved, which she would find out later was in fact the case. Rosa had traced Lydia's finger on a piece of paper with a charcoal pencil and given it to Homer with the directive that he not mess this up, which he had taken extremely seriously. He kissed her then, for the first time, standing in the frost-bright morning air in the yard of her small farm with the chickens and the mules as witnesses, and it was warm and careful and entirely wonderful, and she thought that she had fixed a gate every morning for a month and had ended up here, which was the most unlikely and most perfect arithmetic she could imagine. They were married on the first Saturday of December in the small church at Sagebrush Creek with Reverend Albright presiding, and Rosa Garcia was Lydia's witness, and Pete Dawson, looking more dignified than anyone had previously suspected he was capable of, stood with Homer. Calhoun Reed cried at the back of the church, which he later claimed was due to dust in his eyes, and nobody bothered to dispute this because it was a kind lie and kindness cost nothing. Lydia wore the blue dress again, freshly pressed, with her mother's ivory combs, and Homer wore a dark suit that he had apparently possessed since some previous formal occasion and that still fit him well, and the church was small and the ceremony was short and honest, and when Reverend Albright said, "You may kiss your bride," and Homer kissed her with the same careful warmth as that first frost morning kiss, she heard Rosa sniff, and she smiled against his lips and felt him feel the smile and smile back. Afterward there was a small celebration at Rosa and Rafael Garcia's house, because Rosa had organized it with the efficiency of a woman who considered celebrations a civic duty, and there was food enough for 30 and music from Rafael's fiddle, and from a boy named Santiago who played the guitar with ferocious enthusiasm, and the whole town seemed to come through at some point to eat and drink and shake Homer Finley's hand and tell Lydia Chandler, who was now Lydia Finley, that they were very glad for her. Old Mr. Beaumont from the general store came and told Homer that he was the luckiest man in the county, which Homer agreed with readily. Mrs. Alderman brought a wedding quilt she had apparently been making in secret for weeks, which touched Lydia more than she could say. Mrs. Holt, the schoolteacher's wife, brought a Dickens novel, a different one, David Copperfield, which she said was for the long winter evenings, and Lydia thanked her and meant it. The Garcia household rang with fiddle music and laughter until well into the evening, and Lydia danced with Homer in the cleared center of the room, and he danced with the serious concentration of a man who had probably not danced much in his life, but who was determined to do it properly. And she found this so endearing that she had to stop herself from laughing, which made him look at her with mock suspicion, which made her laugh anyway. They drove home to the ranch in the wagon in the cold December night, under a sky full of stars, wrapped in a heavy blanket against the cold, Lydia's head against Homer's shoulder, and he had his arm around her, and the bay gelding found its own way home on the familiar road. Lydia moved her things from the small farm to the ranch that week, the two mules walking the road for the last time with the wagon loaded behind them. She kept the farm property. Her deed was hers and it was valid, and she intended to keep it, perhaps for rental income in time, perhaps for a use that hadn't presented itself yet. But the ranch was home now. She learned the rhythms of the larger property quickly, having spent enough mornings and Saturdays and evenings there to understand the basic shape of the days. Pete and Calhoun took the change in stride, Pete with his characteristic equanimity, Calhoun with a visible relief and happiness that he made very little attempt to conceal. The ranch house was larger than she needed for any practical purpose, but she understood now why Homer had built it large. He had been building it for more than just himself, even if he had not admitted this to himself at the time. She rearranged the kitchen to her satisfaction, which Homer accepted without complaint, and she brought her good iron skillet and her mother's china teapot and her mending basket, and these small impositions of her presence in the space felt to both of them like the correct and natural order of things. Winter settled in properly through December and January, with cold nights and occasional light snow that never lasted more than a day or two before the Texas sun dissolved it. And the ranch had the intimate, self-contained quality that winter brought to isolated properties. The world reduced to the house and the barn and the fence lines visible through the frost-hazed air, the days structured around the animals and the fires and the work that could be done indoors. Lydia read Dickens in the evenings, and Homer read his agricultural journals and occasionally his account books, and they talked about everything under the sun, and also spent long, comfortable hours in each other's company saying nothing at all, and she thought frequently that of all the possible graces of a marriage, this one, the ability to be silent together without the silence being a problem, was perhaps the one she was most grateful for. She also mended, of course. She still took in mending from the women in town, partly because the income was useful and partly because she had no intention of giving up her own work just because she had married. And Homer, when she raised this topic with the slight defensiveness of a woman prepared to argue her position, said simply, "Of course you keep the mending. It's yours." And she loved him considerably more at that moment than she already had. February brought a 3-day stretch of genuine cold that froze the creek and killed 3 of the neighbor Caldwell's cattle, who had apparently not gotten them under shelter in time. Homer went over with Pete and helped the Caldwells break ice at their stock tank and move the remaining cattle to the barn, and came home cold and tired and grateful for his own well-built barn and well-maintained fences. "Is the Caldwell operation in trouble?" Lydia asked that evening, ladling beef stew into bowls. "Could be," Homer said, hanging up his coat. "Bill Caldwell's a good man, but he's been stretched thin since the dry summer, lost a lot of grass." He sat down and looked at the stew. "The railroad is going to change things around here. When the spur line comes through, Morrison at the county office says it's coming within 2 years. The cattle economics will shift. The men with enough land and enough stock to make volume sales will be fine. The smaller operations will have to think carefully. What about our operation?" He looked up at that hour, and she saw the quiet pleasure it gave him, the same pleasure she felt saying it. "We're fine," he said. "Better than fine. We've got the grass and the water, and we run good stock. I've been thinking about increasing the herd by another 80 or 90 head in the spring if the prices hold." "And the fence?" she asked with a perfectly level expression. He pointed his spoon at her. "The fence," he said, "is in excellent condition, every gate properly bolted." She smiled and sat down across from him, and they ate their supper in the warm kitchen, while the February wind pressed against the windows, and she thought there was very little in the world that she would change about her life at this particular moment. Spring came to Sagebrush Creek with the suddenness that characterized Texas springs. One week it was winter, cold and brown and still, and the next week it was green and alive and full of noisy birdsong, the bluebonnets already pressing up through the recovering grass along the road. The cattle responded to the new grass with visible enthusiasm, spreading across the pastures and eating with the focused dedication of animals who understood about winter on a cellular level. It was in March that Lydia realized she was expecting a child. She sat with this knowledge for 3 days before she told Homer, not because she was uncertain about his reaction, but because she wanted to know her own feelings about it first. She had not expected this. She had been married to Thomas for 6 years, and they had not had children, and she had quietly made her peace with the likelihood that she was simply not able to have them. This had been a grief of its own, a quiet one, sitting alongside the other griefs of her life. And now this. She told Homer on a Sunday evening after supper, sitting on the front porch in the early spring air. She said it directly, the way she said most things. "I'm expecting a baby. I believe sometime in late September or early October." Homer was very still for a moment. The kind of still that is not the absence of feeling, but the complete presence of too much feeling arriving all at once to be processed in real time. Then he turned to her, and his face was doing something she had not seen it do before, something open and undone and entirely unguarded, like a man who has just been handed something he had long since stopped hoping for. "Lydia," he said, and there was nothing after it, just her name, but there was a world in the way he said it. She reached out and put her hand against his face, and he turned into the touch, and she felt the tension in him and then the release of it. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm very well," she said. "I'm actually remarkably well." "A baby," he said, as though he was learning the word. "A baby," she confirmed. He took her hand from his face and held it against his chest, and she could feel his heart under her palm, steady and fast at once. "I didn't think," he started and stopped. "Neither did I," she said gently. "But here we are." "Here we are," he said, and he smiled the slow, rising sun smile that she loved, and he pulled her close and held her carefully in the evening air, and she rested against him and listened to the mockingbird in the cedar tree at the corner of the porch doing its impossible imitations of every other bird in the county. The pregnancy was comfortable, which she was grateful for, and her life continued its good rhythms through the spring and into the summer. She continued to take in mending, adjusting her posture at the chair as the months passed. She walked the East Road on her morning errands as she always had, and every time she passed the gate, the solid, properly bolted gate with its sound cedar posts, she touched it once, her palm flat against the weathered wood, and felt the particular fondness for a thing that had set a whole life in motion. Homer, who had spent his adult life managing cattle with focused practicality, turned out to have both opinions and feelings about the coming child in quantities that surprised Lydia and delighted her. He read a medical pamphlet that Morrison at the county office had somehow produced from somewhere, and studied it with the same attention he gave his agricultural journals. He fixed every loose board in the floor of the upstairs bedroom that he was converting into a nursery, and drove twice to Abilene, a substantial journey, to acquire a proper crib, which he assembled in the nursery with Pete's assistance and Calhoun's enthusiastic commentary. "Calhoun is going to be absolutely intolerable about this baby," Lydia told Rosa one afternoon in June, when they were sitting on Lydia's on their porch with their coffee. "He already is," Rosa said cheerfully. "He told Raphael at church last Sunday that he was going to teach the baby to rope calves. The baby is not yet born." "The baby is not yet born," Lydia agreed. "This is good," Rosa said. She looked at Lydia with her warm, knowing eyes. "This is very good, Lydia, all of this." "I know," Lydia said. "When I think about where you were 3 years ago, 2 years ago," Rosa shook her head. "And now." "And now," Lydia said softly. The summer moved through its heat, and its beauty, and the ranch was full and alive. The cattle doing well, the grass holding better than the previous year, and Lydia grew larger and more deliberate in her movements. And Homer became increasingly attentive in the way that a man becomes attentive when the person he loves most in the world is carrying something irreplaceable. He was never overprotective. She was firm on this point, and he understood it, having married a woman who had been fixing his gait without being asked for a month before he'd even known about it, which told him something important about the character he was dealing with. But he was present. He came in for midday meals when before he had often stayed on the range. He walked with her on the Thursday morning errands, not suggesting she stay home, just coming with her, and she found she did not mind the company at all. September arrived and the air began its autumn shift, and on a clear, warm morning in the last week of September, the baby came. Rosa was there, having ridden over from the Garcia place at Lydia's request when the labor began, and the town's doctor, Dr. Harmon, who was a competent man with a steady manner that Lydia had always appreciated, arrived within the hour. Homer paced the front porch for the better part of 12 hours with Pete sitting on the step with him in silent solidarity, and Calhoun rode to town twice on unnecessary errands because he could not stay still. At 4 in the afternoon, with the golden autumn light coming through the bedroom windows, Lydia's son was born. He was healthy and loud about it, which Dr. Harmon said was the best possible report, and Rosa emerged onto the porch with a broad smile and told Homer he had a son, and Homer stood very still for one long moment and then said, "Can I see her?" And Rosa laughed and said yes. He was careful holding the baby, in the way of a man who handles large animals daily and understands the difference in scale required, and he stood at the side of the bed where Lydia lay tired and warm and completely satisfied, and he looked at his son with an expression she knew she would spend the rest of her life trying to find adequate words for. "He's very small," Homer said. "He will get larger," she said. Homer laughed, and the baby startled at the sound and then settled, and Homer looked from the baby to Lydia with those gray-green eyes full of everything he had ever held quietly in himself, all of it present at once. "Thank you," he said, and the simplicity of it contained more than any elaborate speech could have. They named the baby William Thomas Finley, William for Homer's father, who had built the ranch from nothing, and Thomas for Lydia's first husband, whom she had loved and who deserved to be remembered in something that would outlast stone and wood. Homer had suggested this himself, without prompting, which told her everything about the man she had married. William was a healthy, vigorous baby who grew with the determination of all the living things in that high, clear country, and the ranch house that had been built for more than one person found itself inhabited in the way it had always been intended. Pete Dawson, who had seemed ageless and immovable as a cedar post for years, was observed on multiple occasions making remarkably undignified faces at the baby through the kitchen window, apparently when he believed himself unobserved. Calhoun Reed did not even bother with the pretense of restraint. He held the baby whenever Lydia would allow it and talked to him with the earnestness of a young man who had never had a younger sibling and was discovering that he had strong opinions about how babies should be spoken to. Christmas of 1883 was the largest the Finley household had ever seen. Rosa and Raphael came and brought their son and his wife, and Pete and Calhoun ate at the big table with the family as they always did on holidays, and Dr. Harmon and his wife came, and old Mr. Beaumont and Mrs. Alderman and the schoolteacher Mrs. Holt. The table that seated 6 was added to with boards and sawhorses until it stretched the length of the kitchen and into the adjoining room, and there was more food than anyone could manage, and the fiddle music went on until midnight. William Thomas Finley, aged 3 months, slept through most of it in the cradle near the fire, with a blanket Rosa had knitted for him in colors that Rosa had described as appropriate for a rancher's son, which is to say practical but not dull. Homer stood at the edge of the celebration at one point, not apart from it but at its perimeter, watching the room full of people and warmth and noise, and Lydia came to stand beside him, her shoulder against his arm, and he put his arm around her, and she felt the steadiness and warmth that had been the thing about him from the gate, from the porch, from the first morning they had truly looked at each other. "Good Christmas," she said. "The best I've ever had," he said. "Not close." She looked up at him. He was looking around the room with the expression of a man who is taking full inventory of his blessings and finding them sufficient. "I owe it all to a loose hinge bolt," she said. He looked down at her with that slow, complete smile. "You could have just walked past it." "It needed fixing," she said. He tightened his arm around her and kissed the top of her head. "It did," he agreed, "and thank God for it." The years moved forward with the inexorable pleasant rhythm of a well-run life. William learned to walk in the spring of 1884, lurching across the kitchen floor with the optimistic momentum of a creature who has not yet learned about falling and is thus unbothered by the possibility. He learned to talk shortly after, with a specific early emphasis on the words horse and gate and mama and Pete, which last word Pete Dawson found more gratifying than he ever admitted. In 1885, Lydia found herself expecting again, and told Homer on the same porch where she had told him the first time in the same spring evening air, and he reacted with the same stillness, and then the same complete joy, all of it familiar and entirely new at once. This baby was a girl, born in November of 1885, and they named her June Rosa Finley, June for the month that had set everything in motion, and Rosa for the woman who had been Lydia's friend through grief and joy and all the ordinary days between. Rosa came to see her namesake within the day and declared her exactly perfect, and spent an hour holding her, while Raphael stood at her elbow looking amused and proud in equal parts. William was 2 years old and did not fully understand the baby, but had very strong feelings about her presence in the house, feelings that ranged from fierce protectiveness to baffled resentment depending on the time of day and the specific circumstance of whether the baby was being quiet or not. The ranch grew. The railroad spur line came through in 1886, as Morrison had predicted, and the cattle economics did shift, and Homer's preparation, the increased herd, the careful maintenance of grass and water meant they were positioned exactly right when the market opened up. He and Pete rode to Abilene twice that year with good-sized cattle drives, and returned with the satisfied expressions of men whose calculations had proved sound. Calhoun Reed, who had been with them for several years by now, married a girl named Clara from the Caldwell family, old Bill Caldwell's younger daughter, which neatly resolved the question of what would happen to the Caldwell operation, as Calhoun turned out to have more practical agricultural sense than his early talkativeness had suggested. Homer hired a new hand named Jorge Medina, who was quiet and skilled and got on well with Pete. The gate on the east fence stood solid through all of it. Homer had replaced the entire post section in the spring of 1884, doing it properly, setting a new cedar post deep in concrete-mixed caliche rock, hanging a new gate on proper hardware. It was as good a gate as any in the county, and it did not require fixing. Lydia still touched it every time she passed. Homer saw her do this one morning in the spring of 1887, coming in from the range earlier than expected and catching her at the gate with her palm flat against the post in the old familiar way. He rode up and she looked up at him without embarrassment. "Old habit," she said. He dismounted and came to stand beside her at the gate, looking at it with the expression of a man who has understood something that did not need to be explained to him. "Good habit," he said. "It started everything," she said. He took her hand from the gate post and held it in both of his, turning it over once as though looking at something. The garnet ring was still on her finger, worn smooth now with years of work but still solid and still red. "I think about it sometimes," he said. "That morning in July, coming out to the east fence and finding you there with the gate, I didn't know what to make of you. And now," she said. He looked at her steadily, with all the fullness of 5 years of marriage and 2 children and shared work and shared silence, and the particular depth of love that comes not from a single moment but from the accumulated weight of 10,000 ordinary days. "Now I know exactly what to make of you," he said. "Everything." She leaned against him, and his arm came around her, and they stood together at the gate in the spring morning with the grass coming green on either side of the fence, and the sounds of the ranch alive around them, cattle in the distance, the chickens in the yard, William's voice carrying from somewhere near the barn where Pete was letting him help with some small task. And she thought that life was a thing of remarkable and unexpected architecture. That the broken hinge of a gate on a July morning could be the foundation on which an entirely different life was built. She had fixed it because it needed fixing. Everything after had been the most extraordinary gift. The seasons continued to turn, and the land continued to be what it had always been: difficult and generous and mercilessly beautiful. And on Homer Finley's ranch on the East Road out of Sagebrush Creek, the gate stood sound and strong, and a woman who had once been a widow walked past it every morning and was home by nightfall.